In the late 2000s, mainstream gaming leaned heavily into accessibility. Tutorials grew more guided, mechanics became more forgiving, and failure was often met with a soft reset rather than a true consequence. But in 2009, one game arrived to challenge that trend, reviving the thrill of hard earned progress and merciless combat. That game was Demon's Souls, and while it initially stumbled, it would go on to define an entire genre. Developed by FromSoftware and helmed by a relatively unknown director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, Demon's Souls invited players into the bleak kingdom of Boletaria, a land shrouded in mystery and dominated by towering foes, cryptic lore, and a haunting atmosphere. Its punishing difficulty wasn't just a gimmick, it was the very core of the experience, forcing players to adapt, learn, and persist in a world that neither explained itself nor bent to their will. Yet, despite its revolutionary mechanics and now iconic multiplayer elements, Demon's Souls was nearly lost to history. Its troubled development, initial reception, and Sony's reluctance to back it outside of Japan almost doomed it to obscurity. But thanks to word of mouth, critical acclaim, and the sheer tenacity of its fanbase, Demon's Souls defied expectations, paving the way for future games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, and an entire genre that now bears its name. Today, we're stepping beyond the fog door and into the history of Demon's Souls, exploring how it rose from failure to legend. So sharpen your blades, steel your nerves, and join us for today's relentless trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 232nd episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world as its legacy. Today, we're exploring Demon's Souls, the game that laid the foundation for the Souls-like genre, but was nearly left to die before it could make its mark. Released in 2009, Demon's Souls dared to challenge players in an era where games were becoming increasingly forgiving, offering instead a brutal yet rewarding journey filled with cryptic storytelling, methodical combat, and an innovative multiplayer system born from its director's own life experiences. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who has probably died more times in Souls games than he has in real life, but he calls that learning. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, if you could add one quality of life feature to a game like Demon's Souls, what would it be?
You know, that's a tough one, Dave. I don't know that there's any great ones, because I feel like anything would just make it a little too easy. Maybe
And we don't
upgrading weapons a little simpler to farm out materials.
and we don't want easy, do we?
Well, not when you're playing a Souls-like. No, that's not the point.
So let's set the stage for everyone before we move on. Admittedly, you are a fan of this genre, correct?
That is correct.
Would you go as far to say you're a big fan of this genre?
I'm not the biggest fan, but I have put quite a few hours into it.
On the other hand, it is well known that I am not a fan of this genre.
Very true.
That is not to say I have never tried to play games in it, because we know that I have, but it is not my cup of tea.
And that's okay.
That is okay. All right. Well, I still have a story to tell, even if it's not my thing, because, we don't use our biases as a reason to tell a story or not tell a story. We just, we tell a story. That's what history is, right?
It is indeed.
So before I get into the story of Demon's Souls, why don't you share with our listeners what else has happened during the current week in gaming history?
Kicking it off on February 3rd, 1982, Ms. Pac-Man was released, quickly becoming a landmark title in arcade gaming history. Developed by General Computer Corporation as an enhancement kit for the original Pac-Man game, The game was later licensed by Midway and became an official sequel. Ms. Pac-Man introduced several improvements over its predecessor, including new maze designs, dynamic ghost behavior, and intermissions that expanded the game's narrative. The addition of the titular female protagonist also marked an early example of gender representation in gaming. With engaging gameplay and broader appeal, Ms. Pac-Man was both a critical and commercial success, cementing its place as one of the most beloved arcade games of all time.
Oh no, I talked about gender. Man, they're gonna come after me now.
Oh, sure, Dave. I'm not touching that one with a 50-foot pole. On February 2nd, 1999, Trilobite, the pioneering game development studio behind The Seventh Guest and The 11th Hour, officially shut its doors. Known for its groundbreaking work in full motion video and CD-ROM technology during the early 1990s, Trilobite's games were celebrated for innovative storytelling and immersive puzzles. Despite early success, the studio struggled to maintain momentum due to financial mismanagement, declining interest in its niche market, and the industry's shift toward 3D graphics and action oriented gameplay. The closure of Trilobite marked the end of an era for FMV driven adventure games, though its titles remain influential in the history of gaming. We talked about Trilobite in The Seventh Guest during episode 83, so if you'd like to learn more, go give it a listen.
Yeah, you'll learn about how much I loved those games.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how influential they were.
Indeedly doodly.
The Seventh Guest alongside Myst are pretty much the two games that are the reason why CD-ROM technology took off and was added to every computer.
A crazy thought indeed.
But you'll learn that in episode 83, so go listen.
Indeed, you will. Kicking it off with our next topic, again on PCs, and I believe CD-ROM as well, celebrating today of this day of recording its 25th anniversary. Electronic
Wow.
Arts and Maxis released The Sims for PC, a groundbreaking life simulation game created by Will Wright. The Sims allowed players to create and control virtual people, known as Sims, managing their lives, relationships, and homes in a sandbox environment. The game was revolutionary for open ended gameplay, offering endless possibilities for creativity and storytelling. The Sims became a massive success, praised for innovative design and broad appeal across a wide audience. It went on to become one of the best selling PC games of all time, spawning a highly successful franchise with numerous expansions, sequels, and spin offs that continue to be popular to this day. And we learned about some of the psychology behind the series when learning about its origins in episode 23. So give it a listen if you want to go learn more, and know that that episode is in a very different format than we are now. So just take that with a grain of salt.
That is very true. We have changed very much in 210 episodes, roughly.
Yeah, 209.
Yeah, there you go. Close enough.
Next up, on February 7th, 2012, Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning brought a rich and expansive RPG experience to players. Developed by 38 Studios and Big Huge Games, published by Electronic Arts, this ambitious title blended fast paced combat with deep lore crafted by fantasy author R.A. Salvatore. Set in the vibrant world of Amalur, players explored vast regions filled with quests, mythical creatures, and intricate storylines, all backed by Todd McFarlane's striking art direction and Ken Rolston's RPG design expertise. With its dynamic combat system, flexible character customization, and expansive open world design, Reckoning gained critical praise and a dedicated fan base, though its commercial performance fell short of lofty expectations. Despite this, it remains a cherished title known for creativity and the fascinating saga of its development. We learned all about its tumultuous history in episode 76, so if you want to learn more about that and you're in a mood for a good story, go find it.
Do you remember what made its story so good?
Well, I do, Dave, but I can't give it away. You'll just have to go listen and find out.
Let's just say it involved taxpayer dollars.
To learn more, 76.
76.
Last up for this week in gaming history, on February 2018, Shadow of the Colossus returned to captivate a new generation of gamers with a complete remake for the PlayStation 4. Developed by Blue Point Games and published by Sony Interactive Entertainment, This reimagining preserved the heart of the 2005 classic while overhauling its visuals with breathtaking fidelity. Players once again assumed the role of Wander, embarking on a haunting journey across a sprawling, desolate land to defeat 16 towering colossi in a bid to resurrect a fallen loved one. The remake featured updated controls, enhanced lighting, and a stunning sense of scale that brought the emotional weight of the original to life in new and profound ways. Hailed as both a faithful tribute and a technical marvel, Shadow of the Colossus 2018 reaffirmed its place as one of gaming's most revered masterpieces. We learned all about its original development period during episode 164, so give it a listen if you want to learn more about where it came from.
Also, an excellent, excellent game. And as we're going to find out in just a moment, an episode that is relevant to today's episode.
Ooh, fancy that.
Rob, as a child, Hidetaka Miyazaki grew up, as he put it, tremendously poor. His parents were both office workers who couldn't afford books, so Miyazaki borrowed everything he could to get his hands on books at the library, right? He borrowed absolutely everything from the library. Video games, though, were not allowed, as he admitted in an IGN interview. Growing up, he said, I was restricted at home from playing video games until I reached university. Crazy, huh?
Yeah.
Instead, Miyazaki played tabletop games like Steve Jackson's Sorcery, and he was also a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons. And even though he was a prolific reader, he also admitted that he wasn't a very good one. He would reach passages of text that he didn't understand, but instead of asking for help, he would simply let his imagination run wild to fill in the blanks using any illustrations that could be found nearby. And in this way, he began to feel that he was co writing the stories alongside the original authors, contributing to their storytelling efforts. And that's a trait that he feels has served him very well in his current career as a storyteller. But storytelling almost wasn't in the cards for Miyazaki. Unlike most kids in Japan, he once admitted in a Guardian interview, he didn't have a dream. He was not ambitious. And so he went through school and then he went away to college with, just to earn a general degree. He decided to go into social science, sociology, psychology, but he really didn't have a goal in mind. He was just going to college because that's what you did. And after graduating with a social science degree, he briefly thought about using it to apply to video game development studios because the concept of video games was alluring to him. But instead, he fell into a job as an account manager for the Oracle Corporation. Uh, and he did this simply because he was paying his sister's tuition. So it was more out of necessity than anything. And he did this for several years. Several years. But after a while, he began to think about video games again. And later on, he met up with some college friends and he broached the subject, talking about video games. He had been out of it for a while, not playing, and he was thinking about getting back into it. And so he wanted to know what he's been missing. Where do I catch up? What do I do? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so his friends gave him a bunch of suggestions, a bunch of games that they would play. And one of them was Ico, which we talked about in the Shadow of the Colossus episode 164. That is all about Team Ico and their best selling video game, Shadow of the Colossus. And of course, before making Shadow of the Colossus, Team Ico made Ico. In Ico, he saw the possibilities of video games, right? He saw himself as a storyteller again, interacting with someone else to tell a story, and it inspired him to make a career change. But there was a problem with that. At this point, Miyazaki was now 29 years old. And in Japanese culture, it is hard to restart at that age. He's too old to apply for graduate positions. He's now lacking any experience in video game development, competing against all the young college graduates as a 29-year-old who have at least the college underneath them. And so it was a tall order to just drop, from Oracle into video game development. But that didn't deter him. He applied to plenty of studios, heard plenty of no's, but he kept trying until he heard a yes. In fact, one of the only companies that did extend him an offer that was willing to take on a 29-year-old was FromSoftware. Now, I'm not going to touch much on FromSoftware themselves. We learned all about its history as a studio last July in episode 202, where we learned all about the studio and the history of one of its best known series, Armored Core. What you need to know is that in 2004, Miyazaki was hired on as a game planner slash coder halfway through the development of a game called Armored Core Last Raven, which was being developed for the PlayStation 2. And his work on Last Raven left a good impression on the management of FromSoftware, because the following year, in 2000, it would have been 2006, so after the game came out in 2005, the following year, he was asked to be the director on the next main installment of the series, which was Armored Core 4. So he directs Armored Core 4, and from there, the studio decides that they want to make a sequel. So Miyazaki is asked to direct the sequel, which was called Armored Core For Answer. Haha, like the word for FOR, get the word play. I
Yeah,
know,
nice.
isn't that fun? Isn't that
That
fun?
is. I like it.
While working through these games, Miyazaki heard about another game that was in development elsewhere in the studio. Takeshi Kaji, a producer at Sony Computer Entertainment, had approached FromSoftware during this time with a proposition to rediscover a lost breed of action game. I've always loved the dark fantasy genre, Kaji stated in a 2010 interview for Edge magazine. From wizardry right through to King's Field, he added. Yet games that assume that aesthetic these days are usually, at their heart, more like science fiction. So my desire was to revisit this lost area of gaming to rediscover a charismatic corner of the medium. Now, it's really no surprise that Takeshi Kaji was going to FromSoftware. In that quote, he references King's Field as one of the games, when talking about his love for the dark fantasy genre. And as it turns out, King's Field is one of FromSoftware's other very well known video games. So he went right to the source. So as Miyazaki is wrapping up work on the latest Armored Core title For Answer, there were whispers throughout the studio that perhaps that project, their dark fantasy project, wasn't going so well. As it turns out, the team they brought together was severely lacking a coherent vision. So the word was that although they were working on a high fantasy role playing game, it was kind of assumed at this point that it was going to end up a failure for the company. Miyazaki explained in the same Edge interview, I'd always wanted to make a dark fantasy game that drew on the fantasy fighting series of books. The Demon's Souls project was the opening that I'd always been waiting for. So when work wrapped up on Armored Core For Answer, he asked to take over this failing project. He saw it as an opportunity to take the project in any direction he wanted. One that came with no risk because it was already considered a failure. And if it continued in that direction, it wouldn't necessarily reflect poorly on him, right?
Right.
And so he took over the project and sat down with the team to redesign its vision, to redesign its design, so to speak. Now, Miyazaki has said that people need to make comparisons, and therefore, Demon's Souls has been likened to Diablo, Wizardry, Monster Hunter, and even Bushido Blade. Despite what the game looks like, however, he says that he never had a video game influence in mind specifically when writing the design documents. Instead, the team wanted to take a completely different approach to the genre. Instead of building around cutscenes or scenarios like many other action RPGs, Miyazaki and his team sought out to have the player feel rewarded simply for playing the game, and not necessarily for completing a quest or finding loot. Admittedly, though, Miyazaki also feels that one of FromSoftware's other well known games, Kingsfield, was likely the beginning of the Demon's Souls project. In a 2010 Eurogamer interview, he said, "I wouldn't go as far to say that we had Kingsfield in mind while we were making Demon's Souls, but of course, I think its world probably formed one of the bases for the new game. Of course, there are parts of the game that are inspired by Kingsfield, but we were very much aware that we wanted to make a new title with Demon's Souls." I would also like to add that that's probably in response because very, very often Demon's Souls is called the spiritual successor to Kingsfield. And it's been important for Miyazaki to note that they are separate games. One may have an inkling of the other, but we try to make it as different as possible. You know what I mean?
For sure, for sure.
When asked about other sources of inspiration when designing the game, Miyazaki had said that there aren't other games that he'd cite as inspiration, but there are films like Conan the Barbarian, Excalibur, and they even pulled from the fantasy art of Frazetta. So, there were inspiration in their own lives that they pulled from. Now, the world itself, he admitted, likely came from his own interest in stories like King Arthur and Beowulf, classic stories that were frequently interwoven into the Western role playing genre that the team was trying to break into, trying to go back to the basics to work within. And so the team, with all these inspirations and notions in mind, kind of laid down the design document and the basic story, that they were intending to make this project work off of. And all that planning, in all honesty, must have been incredibly successful because he later went on and said that after the first design documents were created, the game concepts changed very little during the development of Demon's Souls.
Hmm.
How do you feel about their approach where he said he wanted to have the player feel rewarded simply for playing the game?
I mean, I I think it's both good and bad.
Can you see that in the design? I mean, let me start by saying, have you played Demon Souls?
Not Demon Souls, no.
Okay, so you haven't played Demon Souls, but you've played Dark Souls, which inevitably is the evolution of Demon Souls in a lot of ways. So that's your experience with it, right?
Correct.
And that trend has never really left. So do you feel that that is the way they design the game? That the reward for playing the game is simply beating the game and not necessarily from the loot or the quest or anything like that?
I Yeah, I would have to say so. Thinking about it, yes, you do get some cool gear throughout that helps, but at the end of the day, like, your gear is only gonna matter so much as long as you're good at the game. Once you just finally beat that last boss that took you a billion tries, that's all the reward, man.
Very, very true. Many of the game mechanics that have become the staples of the entire Souls genre, Demon Souls, Dark Souls, etc. Elden Ring would be the recent one for for this company. There are other examples too. We'll get into. Many of the game mechanics that are from this genre were very much part of this design process. Everyone was settled upon that notion that the team wanted to reward players for simply playing the game, for providing them with a sense of accomplishment. That's Miyazaki was quoted as saying that was their goal in a 2009 Game Informer interview. So that was very much the way the team was assigned to go. Now, one of the things that's weird for a lot of people, Rob, is the unusual multiplayer mechanic, right?
Why is that?
You don't think it's unusual?
I mean, okay, it is definitely different than other
All
games,
right, so
but
let's talk about that because I don't think that this is the most popular genre on the face of the earth. So I think that there's a likelihood that there are going to be people listening to this that aren't going to understand what we're talking about. So in a normal game, multiplayer, you play against other people or with other people at the same time, right? Like in a first person shooter, you're going against a team of other players and things like that. Like that's a normal multiplayer mechanic, right?
yeah,
And this is kind of more passive in some ways. So for one, you can leave messages for other players, right?
yeah, that's true.
And that's a big thing. Now the messages can be good, the messages can be bad. It's a real mixed bag when you play these games. Sometimes they're truthful. Sometimes they're like, hey, jump off this cliff to get a cool thing. You jump off the cliff and you die. Like, that's human nature, you know?
Shouldn't have been dumb.
Shouldn't have been dumb and jumped off the cliff at all.
Yep,
That's your stance on it.
that sure is.
Are you one of the people who writes, like, I have to jump off the cliff to get fun things, so you hope I jump off the cliff?
No, I am not. Never once written a message in those games, actually.
So the other ways, the other multiplayer mechanics, there are ghosts. Basically, when you're navigating levels, you can briefly see ghosts of other players. They may show you hidden passages, switches, things you may not have noticed. When players die, bloodstains are left in other player. Like you see bloodstains in the ground where other players die, almost as a warning. So like people's journeys cross over into other people's journeys. You know, bloodstains on the floor can warn you about traps or traps. I mean, I don't really know any other way to put it. Is that a fair statement?
Either traps or something's about to come and shrek the hell out of you.
And then you can't really play multiplayer through the entire game. The way it works is there's co-op play where you can pull people into the host your world to defeat specific parts of the game, specific bosses, right?
Right.
So it's not just two people going against one another or playing together for the entire game. Like you can only bring people in at certain places, but the bulk of the multiplayer experience is the passive multiplayer experience where you can see the messages and the bloodstains and the ghosts of people that that basically inform you on how to move forward, right?
Right.
So it's a very different concept. That's not really normal for there to be such a passive multiplayer mechanic, and it's very unique to these games and popular. Like people like it in these games. It's kind of cool, you know. So, with the explanation in mind, I should say that that concept came to Miyazaki after an experience he had. Rob, you'll appreciate this on a cold winter day after a heavy snow. He was driving home up a hill when his car suddenly stopped, couldn't make it. It started to slip, and it was just driving in place. He wasn't going to go up, and after a short while, he was going backwards, sliding back down. But there was a car behind him, and he bumped into that car. And then behind them was another car, and they bumped in that car. But with the momentum of all three cars, they started pushing each other up the hill. And so together as one, they all moved forward and they helped one another get up the hill.
Wow.
And as he moved past the hill, what he called the obstacle, he thought to himself that it was disappointing to him that he couldn't stop and say thanks to the people who helped get him over the hump because he gets stuck all over again. And on the way home, he continued to wonder what happened to the people behind him. Did the last person in line make it home? Am I ever going to meet the people that helped me up the hill again? And so that experience stuck with him. And he mulled it over, and it evolved into this multiplayer mechanic that's now found within Demon Souls. He calls it a connection of mutual assistance between transient people.
Wow, that's a name.
I know, right? Because Demon Souls is a game with a lot of dying in it, that kind of fleeting cooperation should come out of all the death, Miyazaki said in a Eurogamer interview. We're all dead, so let's help each other out.
That, yeah, basically.
He said, we made a game where rather than giving players a simple game over, we make them come back to an ephemeral existence as a phantom with less help, and this encourages people to cooperate multiplayer. Because you can both cooperate and aggravate through this unique multiplayer system, even if 100 players are role playing in this way, they will all have different experiences. And whether you behave as friend or foe is up to a person's character. So, he has all these interesting, I mean, it is. It's really interesting, right? Because, again, some people can leave you messages that are like helpful, and some people can leave you messages that are downright devious. I think it's funny when I jump off a cliff and get nothing, right?
Yeah.
So Demon Souls was first announced in early October 2008 through Famitsu magazine, and it was playable the following month at the Tokyo Game Show. Reaction at the Tokyo Game Show was described as nothing short of a disaster due to the game's unexpectedly hard difficulty. Many people playing the game, including the president of Sony at the time, as the story goes, couldn't even make it past the starting area. And so he, in particular, thought it was trashed, and many people who played the game assumed that the game was still in development. But the truth of the matter was that at that point, the game was mostly finished.
People were just bad late in the game.
Rob, hearing about how Demon Souls was dismissed early on, even how Sony didn't have faith in it, really makes me think about how sometimes the best ideas take time to be appreciated.
Yeah, it's crazy how a game that struggled at launch ended up defining an entire genre. It just goes to show if you've got something unique to share, you got to put it out there and let the world decide.
Exactly. And if you ever wanted to share your own stories, opinions, or deep dives into gaming history, podcasting is one of the best ways to do it. And thanks to Zencaster, starting a podcast is easier than ever.
But what makes Zencaster so special?
Well, Zencaster is an all in one podcasting platform that lets you record high quality audio and video straight from your browser. There's no complicated setups, no expensive equipment. Just log in, hit record, and start sharing your voice.
All right, but what about editing? I imagine that can be a grind, kind of like trying to get through Demon Souls without dying.
Well, that's the best part. Zencaster does the heavy lifting for you in this case. Their post production tools automatically clean up your audio, balance sound levels, and even remove background noise and filler words like or It's like having a blacksmith ed for your podcast, refining it into something legendary.
Well, that sounds awesome. But once it's ready, how do I get my podcast out for people to listen?
Well, Zencaster makes distribution a breeze too. You can send your podcast directly to major platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, all from the Zencaster website. No need to worry about the technical side, just focus on making great content.
Well, you sold me. But how can our listeners get started?
It's simple. Head over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane. You can get 30% off the first month of any paid plan. Whether you're launching your first episode or looking to level up your current show, Zencaster has all the tools to make you sound like a pro.
That sounds like a great deal. So, listeners, if you've got a passion for gaming, storytelling, or really anything else, now's the time to start sharing.
Absolutely. Head to zencaster.com/pricing, use our offer code, memory card lane, and you can take the first step on your podcasting journey.
And with that, let's get back to how Demon Souls went from overlooked to legendary.
So, when Demon Souls was finally released in Japan on February 5th, 2009, it received a ton of negative feedback from the press, the general press, and some video game critics. But for the most part, actual video game critics, a large majority of them were giving it high scores. If you look back now, you'll see there are a lot of 9 out of 10s it got from various publications. But because of the negative feedback that started from the Tokyo Game Show, initial sales in Japan were very, very slow. The game only sold 39,000 copies in its first week, which was not great for a game in 2009.
Wow.
With that being said, it's one of those games that as more and more people bought the game and loved it, positive word of mouth began to spread slowly. Oh, so slowly. And as a result, sales began to pick up. By the end of the year, they had sold 134,000 copies, which at this point was a decent enough amount for the company to consider the game a success.
Yeah, I'd say so at that point.
But the game's publisher, which at the time was Sony, still didn't understand the game. Like I said, the president of Sony had played it at the Tokyo Game Show, didn't understand it, wasn't a fan. And so Sony didn't have any faith in it. They had no plans to bring the game outside of Japan. They had no plans to localize it in any other territory than Japan. It was, to them, it was a failure. It was going to get that one release and it was going to stay there, and that was going to be that. They weren't even going to license it. But in time, they were harassed enough that they did. And Atlas, we've covered Atlas before. They are the company that is known for the Shin Megami Tensei and Persona series. They bought the North American licensing rights and worked to get the game localized over to English. On October 6th, 2009, the game was finally released in North America. Now, Atlas, given its Japanese release, had very moderate expectations for the game. They only expected to sell 75,000 copies altogether. They only prepared an initial shipment to the United States of 15,000 copies of the game. In the first month, it sold 150,000 units.
Damn.
By March of 2010, which would have been what? It came out in October, so 5 months, 6 months. It had sold 250,000 copies.
Okay.
In September, so just under a year, right? They announced that it was going to be sold under the Sony's Greatest Hits label, which means
Damn.
they sold over 500,000 units. And so basically, everyone in this story underestimated how many gamers rather, were looking for a challenge, right?
Right.
Because
That's
that's the
wow.
draw of the game. That's the draw of the Souls-like genre. Is that fair?
100%.
Is that why you like it?
Yeah, no, I think it is. It's like I said, it's just that rewarding feeling you get after you've just grinded the hell out of something, beat your head against the wall a billion times, but you finally get that one win and it's just like, damn, it was worth it.
Yeah, it's where I struggle. I struggle with challenge because my time is precious nowadays, and I don't like to be challenged in my video games. I know that sounds bad. I mean I get it, but I mean it literally at this point in my life, because there's so many games I want to play, and I want an opportunity to move from one game to a next, but the same opportunity to experience the games at the same time. I'm now the guy that puts it well, I'd say very frequently on casual, which does happen sometimes, but I think normal is probably more for me because I feel guilty putting it on casual. But the truth of the matter is, I don't like being challenged anymore because my time is valuable, and I feel like the time that it takes to get through that isn't rewarding for me. It's frustrating to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I get it. You're
So,
wrong, but I get it.
but it's funny though, because we when Elden Ring came out, which is the most recent Souls-like game, so to speak, we all got it. I'm pretty sure you bought it for me, if I'm not mistaken, because I think it came out around my birthday that year.
Probably, I don't remember, but
I'm
sounds
pretty
right.
sure you got it for me because I wasn't going to buy it for myself, but then I ended up beating it before you did. So,
Yeah.
I mean, and I really enjoyed it. Like, I know it was hard, but I really enjoyed it. And I did feel a sense of accomplishment every time I got there. I remember I remember seeing on TikTok or YouTube, it was probably YouTube, at the time. I don't know if TikTok was as popular as it is now, but I remember seeing all these videos about how hard one of the bosses was. This is the hardest boss in the game. This hardest boss in the game. Hardest boss in the game. It was the boss that guy who was like, "This boss can't touch me," who would pop into people's games and beat that boss for the people and then leave, like the hero guy. Do you remember that story?
Not offhand,
No.
no.
So there was a guy and his character name was literally like this boss name. I can't remember the boss name. Can't touch me. And all he would do was sit there at that boss. And when people called, because it has the same mechanic where you can like
Oh, you
put
know
out
what?
a,
Yeah, no, I remember.
and that's all he ever did was he would just sit there and
Beat that
spawn into
boss.
other
Yep.
people's games and help them get through the boss. It was the female boss towards the end
Melina.
of the, yeah, Melina towards the end of the game. I remember seeing video, hardest boss, hardest boss, hardest boss, how'd you get it? And then like I got there and I think I beat her on the third try. And it was such a freaking triumph for me because I went there expecting that I was never gonna beat her, right? And it didn't feel like a struggle getting her on the third try. It felt like a couple tries to learn her pattern and then just nailing it, you know?
Yeah, that's
So
exactly it.
I know. So I guess I say I don't get it, but at the same time I do get it. But I also understand why I struggle with this with it the way I do, with it, the way I do. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
because my time is valuable.
If you say so, Dave.
You don't think so?
I don't think your time is valuable.
I knew you were gonna say that. What else do you like about the Souls-like games, other than the difficulty?
I think that it's cool. The maps are always beautiful, breathtaking. Obviously, there's a lot of death, decay, carnage, and whatnot. But it's really cool, like medieval style. Always looks cool. The character designs are pretty damn cool. Obviously, I love me some RPG. So being able to set all your attributes and pick a class based on what attributes you select and what items you gather. And then I think that the prestiging in the game is really cool. You have New Game Plus when you beat the game and all of its bosses. You get to go back and do it again on a harder difficulty, and I think that that's pretty cool. It gives its replayability that's kind of guided instead of just like, hey, just keep doing the same things over and over, but it's going to be the same as it always was. So some of the stuff's going to be stupid. It actually levels up with you, so it gives you incentive to keep playing on that same character.
Well, so we talked about the unusual multiplayer, but there's also the concept of the Souls system because it's Demon Souls, right? And then it was Dark Souls. And so at the center of all that was the concept of Souls. And in the development of the game, the Soul system was a frequent subject of discussion, right? They had to balance. So let's talk about what Souls are. So, Souls are what you use to upgrade yourself, correct?
Correct.
And you collect them as you kill enemies, but when you die, you drop them until you get back to your where you died, right?
Right. And pick them up.
And pick them up. Yep, and pick them up. And so this was a topic of like a lot of debate during it, right? I mean, they debated a lot of things. They actually at one point talked about making it permanent death in the game period, like permanent death for everyone.
Yeah, that would have been rough.
Yeah, that would have been real rough, wouldn't it?
The game's a little too tough for that. I mean, obviously, people out here are going to be like, "Oh, it's super easy. I know I get no hit all the time." Like, it's good for you, bro. But like, no, that'd be tough for a vast majority of Souls players.
And so like they settled on the concept of souls. It was kind of a compromise in the difficulty without going too far, right? Because they wanted to be a consequence to dying, because there really wasn't one otherwise. If you didn't drop your souls, you just start over at the last checkpoint and move forward, you know. So if you drop your souls, there's consequence to dying. There's some suspense, and there is a reason to not die, right? To keep collecting as many souls as possible. And then even though you drop them when you died, like dropping them when you die is akin to permadeath, and they said, this is a little too difficult. They developed the idea of dropping them and having to come back to them as a compromise between the two extremities, right? A way for people to recoup their loss, but still some suspense and some difficulty, some difficulty
Oh,
in
and there's
how.
many times that you go to get them and you just yet you don't get there. You don't,
Yeah, I know. I've done that. I've done that too. It's really, really frustrating. Really, really frustrating.
especially when you had enough to level up. Mm-mm.
We talked about the unusual multiplayer comment. I do want to say one more thing kind of before we move on and kind of look into wrapping things up. We look at the unusual multiplayer mechanic as being something weird, so to speak, but that was kind of done on purpose. They didn't want parties. They didn't want quest parties. They didn't want groups of people to play the game together. They wanted it to be a single player experience, but they wanted to add multiplayer as a way to enhance a single player experience, not as a way to replace it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that they hit the nail on the head with that one with what they did.
I like what they did. I think that one of my favorite things about the couple that I've played at this point is I think they do a really good job at making you feel isolated, even though there's the bloodstains and the messages and everything. Like for me, like you always feel so alone in these really dark gothic environments.
Yeah,
And so
no,
I also like that as a design choice.
they hit the nail on the head with that one. I do agree. I think it's fantastic. Just good. Yeah. I again, if you never played them, you might hate them, but if you're willing to give them a try, I think they're well worth it.
Indeed. So it may have took time, obviously, because we looked at how initially when these Demon Souls was released in all the territories, it was a slow sell, right? But eventually, everywhere it picked up. Eventually becoming a Sony's greatest hit, and being sold. After hitting that 500,000 mark. In hindsight, Demon Souls is cited by various publications as one of the greatest games of all time. It is historically relevant for sure. It is the first game in what we now call the Souls-like genre. The name of the game is literally in the genre. The same way we have, Metroidvania, we have Souls-like that started with Demon Souls, and it is a genre that's expanded. Right? It's a genre that's known for what? What's it known for? Crushing difficulty,
Making anger.
making anger, making anger.
It
Arrgh.
is what caused it is the creation of anger.
If you want to know technically, because I didn't look this up while I was doing my research, but it dawned on me as I was doing here. I wanted to know what technically like what it is, so I looked up the Wikipedia entry. It says Souls-like games typically have a high level of difficulty where repeated player character death is expected and incorporated as part of the gameplay, with players often keeping part of their progress since the last checkpoint and other losses being potentially recoverable. So there you go. High level of difficulty.
Indeed.
A Souls-like is a subgenre of action role-playing games known for high difficulty level and an emphasis on environmental storytelling, typically in a dark fantasy setting.
There you go.
FromSoftware themselves has given us many, many great examples in the same genre. The Dark Souls series, which was the successor to this, that Rob is a huge fan of. We've done an episode on Dark Souls. Before we had this format, it wasn't really a history episode. I would like to revisit it as a history episode, and I have that on a list of future topics I'd like to cover, but we just haven't gotten there yet. I think, what did we look at in that episode? I know we talked about, you and Damon talked about how much you loved it, but didn't I find like 10 Ways to Live Your Life by Dark Souls and we covered that list or something like that?
I can't 100% remember, but it does sound familiar.
I'm almost positive
Uh,
that's what it was. I found this like because we were more topical back when we didn't really talk about history. We talked about the games and fun things about them. And I'm pretty sure I found like ways to live your life like a Dark Souls, and it was all these ways that you could apply Dark Souls to real life. And we had a good laugh over that. So
All I remember, and I don't know if it got cut from the end result or not, is Damon played 13,000 hours of those games, and he had some wolf dogs that reminded him of one of the characters in it.
God, that is so much time. My God. Bloodborne, another FromSoftware example. Sekiro, another FromSoftware example. Elden Ring, of course, being the most recent one. There are other companies that make Souls-like games. Lies of P, uh, released on the Game Pass, I think last year, is a good example of a Souls-like. Lords of the Fallen, another. I think there's two of them now. Another Souls-like series made by another company. So it's definitely, a genre. Oh, Salt and Sanctuary. I'm just gonna start blurting out names as they come into my head.
There you go.
Oh
Always
look,
goes well.
I'm sitting here staring now at the whatchamacallit, Titan Souls, the Surge. There's two of those now. The Remnant series, Code Vein. They consider the Star Wars Jedi series Souls-like, both Fallen Order and Survivor. And I don't, but I can understand how people would. It's weird to me that I have a different perspective, but those are Souls-like apparently.
No, it is.
No, yeah, I mean I see it now. I mean you drop your stuff, you lose your upgrade materials. So yeah, I get it. It's hard. It's the same concept of pattern recognition. So lots of games in the Souls-like genre that started with Demon Souls. Not only that, but if you do want to play Demon Souls, From Software revisited the game itself in 2020. They remade it for the PlayStation 5, so current generation players could enjoy the game with some modern quality of life upgrades. And if you look at reviews of the 2020 version, a lot of them see it as superior to the original game because now we have more technology and it plays better. Frankly, anytime that you can make one of these games run smoother because of the nature of pattern recognition, it's going to be seen as a better game, right? You have a 2020 version. It's only on PS5. I went to look and see if they did a PC release, and they haven't yet, unfortunately, because I was like, "Ooh, we can get this and play through it finally." No, just
Nope, nope, nope.
just PlayStation 5.
Yep, not for me. Maybe you, but not me.
Demon Souls is undoubtedly an important game in video game history. It's the start to an entire genre, the beginning of Souls-like games themselves that would later give way to Dark Souls, Elden Ring, and all these other fun stuff. So again, as Rob said, if you've never played it, go and play it. I would encourage you to do so. You might like it. You never know. I might
You
like it.
never know.
I, you
Dave
know,
did like it.
Well, I mean, I played Dark Souls. Dude, I remember how excited I was for Dark Souls. I was so excited for Dark Souls. I think I told this story on the freaking Dark Souls podcast. I was so excited. I was hyped. The way they talked about it, the high fantasy concept, everything, I was hyped. It was one of those games that like I think I pre-ordered. Got it on day number 1, and I took it home and I think I played it for an hour and I put it down and I never ever 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 picked it up ever again. Ever. And then you bought me Elden Ring, and I was like, maybe I do like it. So then I went back and played some of them, and they're not as bad as I recall. So
Exactly. See, you just got more patient in your old age.
that's probably true. That's actually probably very true. So anyway, all right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to dive deeper into the history of Demon Souls or explore any of the topics we touched on today, be sure to visit us at www.memorycardlane.com. There you'll find our show notes where we link our sources so you can continue learning beyond this episode. While you're there, why not browse our archive of past episodes? If today's discussion sparked your interest, you might enjoy our look at Shadow of the Colossus in episode 164 or the seventh guest in episode 83. Rob, what else can people find on our website?
Well, you can find a calendar of our future episode topics so you know what we are going to be discussing in future weeks. You can find a link to our Discord server where you can come talk with Dave and I about either episode topics or just whatever else you kind of want to touch base with us on. You can find links to our Patreon where you can get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our episodes. You can find links to our social medias where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David_is_wrong. Each week, ladies and gents, we tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a console, technology, just some topic I have somehow tied to this week in publication history. While doing so, we hope to teach you something new about the game, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, of course, we looked at Dark Souls. No, Demon Souls. No, Dark Souls. No, I'm just kidding. It's Demon Souls. I know which one it is.
Goodness gracious.
I'm just kidding. I know which one it is. It's Demon Souls.
Yeah, yeah, sure you do.
Every week when I sit down to do research for a new episode, I learn things. And that's my favorite part, to be honest with you, because that's what I look for. Every week when I sit down, I look for things I didn't know. I comb through interviews and books and everything. And I look for things that are new to me. And I get excited when I learn new things. And I get even more excited by the fact that I get to teach you, our listeners, new things. That's the best part about this. It's a beautiful cycle of teaching and learning, and in recognition of said cycle, we like to go round table and talk about our takeaways. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I learned that the Souls likes almost never made it out of Japan.
Isn't that crazy?
The president just, he was like you. He couldn't play the games. He was bad at them and almost gave him the kibosh. And that's, it's a good thing it didn't happen because clearly they were pretty damn successful if they're still around today, dropping new games and getting huge amounts of sales. So it's a blessing that other people were like, yeah, this is actually a really good game, and overruled the president.
Yeah.
So it just goes to show you, just because you're bad presidents doesn't mean don't listen to your underlings.
I'm gonna piggyback off that for my learning, my topic of learning today.
Okay.
So I think it goes even further than that, right? Because think of all the times in which this project couldn't have been. That's definitely one of them. It went to TGS and it got a lot of negative feedback. And right there, Sony could have put the lid on it and said, like, no point, right? We don't think this is going to be popular enough. Shut it down. But even before that, Takeshi Kaji brought this over, from Sony and said, "Hey, I want to do a high fantasy game." Brought it to FromSoftware, and it was a disaster from the beginning. Like, what if Miyazaki had never got his hands on it, right? What if
Yeah, that's
what
true.
what if he had never got his hands on it? What if he decided to move on to another game in the Armored Core series, and this little project, this high fantasy project that was somewhere in the corner of From Software that was doomed to fail, was left to fail?
Yeah, no, you definitely never know. It's a blessing that all of the stars aligned on this one.
Yeah, there's definitely just all of these touch points where this game had to fight and scrape and chew its way through all these obstacles. It had to fight through a lot of adversity, which is ironic considering that's the game series. Like, that's the gameplay of a Souls like game, right? This high challenge, high difficulty, and you're rewarded with an incredibly high sense of accomplishment when you get through it. And the irony is that's the way the game had to come into existence itself. So,
What's the old saying? Like art mimics life or
yeah,
something?
yeah, art imitates life. Absolutely. It's perfect. That's a perfect example of it. Perfect example of it. So that's my takeaway. I'm gonna piggyback off yours. So all right, well that'll wrap it up for Demon Souls. But before I wrap it up and look into next week, is there anything that you'd like to add to today's episode?
Well, as always, I want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to all of our listeners. It means the world to us to have you along as we get the absolute crap beat out of us week in and week out. But hey, we're enjoying it. We're still playing the games. We're still talking about the history. So thank you much for joining us.
That concludes our journey through the fog shrouded world of Demon Souls. What began as a nearly forgotten project, a game dismissed by its own publisher and written off as a failure, went on to spark one of the most influential gaming movements of the modern era. It redefined what challenge in games could mean, proving that brutal difficulty wasn't just an obstacle, but a tool to create deep satisfaction and immersion. From its haunting atmosphere to its groundbreaking multiplayer mechanics, Demon Soul carved a path that countless games have followed, from Dark Souls to Elden Ring and beyond. Whether you face Boletaria's horrors firsthand or simply appreciate what it brought to gaming, there's no denying its legacy. Demon Souls isn't just a game, It's a testament to perseverance, both in its gameplay and in its journey to recognition. And just like the players who keep pushing forward after every brutal defeat, the series it inspired continues to grow stronger with each new iteration. Next week, we're swapping relentless difficulty for high speed chaos as we take the wheel in Crazy Taxi. Released in 1999, this arcade classic let players embrace their inner daredevil as they raced against the clock to deliver passengers through bustling city streets. With its punk rock soundtrack, wild jumps, and rule breaking gameplay, Crazy Taxi was more than just a driving game, it was an experience. Buckle up because next week we're going full throttle on another exciting trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.